This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about the question that I believe sits at the center of more quiet suffering than almost anything else in modern life. Not depression, not failure, not bad luck or poor circumstance. The gap, the distance between knowing and doing, between understanding exactly what needs to happen and still, somehow, not making it happen, between the person you are in your own mind and the person who shows up in your actual life every day. If you are watching this channel for the first time, this is what we talk about here. Not motivation, not hype, not the highlight reel version of someone else's transformation. We talk about the real, grinding, deeply human experience of being a capable person who cannot fully close the gap between who they know they are and how they actually behave. And I want to start today by saying something directly to you. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not the exception to every rule of growth and change that seems to work for everyone around you. You are experiencing something that has a name, a structure, a specific psychological mechanism that researchers have studied for decades. And once you understand what is actually happening inside that gap, not the surface version, not the motivational reframe, but the real architecture of it, something shifts. It shifted for me, after years of living inside that gap and not being able to explain it. That is what today is about. I want to describe someone to you, and I want you to tell me, honestly, how much of this person you recognize. This person is intelligent, perceptive, probably one of the more self-aware people in any room they walk into. They understand their patterns. They have read the books, done some version of the inner work, had the conversations with themselves at 1 a.m. that most people never have. They know their weaknesses. They know their tendencies. They can articulate exactly what they need to do to move their life in the direction they want it to go. And they are stuck, not visibly stuck. From the outside, they look fine, capable, perhaps even impressive. They show up, they function, they produce enough to maintain the appearance of forward motion. But inside, they know. They know that the most important things keep not getting done, that the version of themselves they can see clearly in their mind has not fully arrived in their actual daily behavior, that there is a gap between the person they know they are capable of being and the person they are actually being right now. And the most painful part, the part that keeps them up at night more than any external problem, is that they cannot explain why. They have the knowledge, they have the insight. They have, in many cases, more self-understanding than people who seem to be executing far more effectively. So why doesn't the knowing translate into doing? That was me for most of my 30s. That is the question I lived inside for years without an answer that satisfied me. After my business collapsed in 2011, I went through a period of intense self-examination. I read everything I could find about psychology, behavior, performance, execution. I spoke to therapists, mentors, coaches. I built frameworks, wrote plans, redesigned my routines. And I noticed something that disturbed me. I was getting smarter about my problem without getting better at it. I could explain my procrastination in clinical detail. I could describe my self-sabotage patterns with the precision of someone who had studied them carefully, because I had. I could predict, almost to the day, when a new habit would begin to break down. I could see the avoidance behavior coming before it arrived, and still not stop it. The knowledge and the behavior had become completely disconnected, as if they were operating in two separate systems that had no reliable channel between them. I remember sitting with a therapist I was seeing at the time, a man named Dr. Harlan, quiet and methodical, not given to dramatic insights, and saying to him in genuine frustration, "I understand all of this. I understand why I do it. So why does understanding it not change it?" He paused for a long time before he answered. And what he said sent me down a research path that eventually became the foundation of everything I now understand about execution. He said, "Oscar, insight lives in the mind. Behavior lives in the identity. And those are not the same address." The psychological concept at the center of today's conversation is what researchers call the identity-action gap. And to understand it properly, I need to introduce you to several researchers whose work, taken together, explains why intelligent, self-aware people so consistently fail to act on what they know. The first is William James, the 19th century American philosopher and psychologist who is widely regarded as the father of modern psychology. James made an observation about human behavior that was ahead of his time by more than a century. He said that the great thing in education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy, that habits must be automatic, that the behavior must live in the body, not only in the conscious mind, for it to be reliably executed under the pressure of real life. What James was pointing at, before neuroscience had the tools to confirm it, is the distinction between declarative knowledge and procedural identity. Declarative knowledge is knowing what to do. Procedural identity is being someone who does it automatically, and the distance between those two things is not crossed by understanding alone. This was confirmed in remarkable detail a century later by the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio at the University of Southern California. Damasio's research on patients with damage to the prefrontal cortex produced a finding that shook the scientific community. These patients retained full intellectual capacity. They could reason, analyze, understand consequences, describe correct courses of action in precise detail. But they could not make effective decisions or follow through on behavior in real life. Damasio concluded that cognition and action are not the same neurological process. Understanding a correct behavior and executing it consistently are powered by different systems in the brain. The intellectual understanding of what you should do lives primarily in the prefrontal cortex. The consistent execution of behavior lives in networks that connect identity, emotion, and habit, deeper, older systems that are not updated simply by adding new information to the mind. In plain language, knowing the right thing to do does not automatically update the system that produces your behavior. Those are different departments. And most people spend their entire lives trying to fix a behavioral problem by adding more knowledge to the wrong department. This is also the core of what James Clear articulates in Atomic Habits when he argues that behavior change is really identity change. Clear synthesizes decades of behavioral research into one clean principle. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you believe you are. And the gap between who you know you could be and who you are currently being is not a knowledge gap. It is an identity gap. The behavior that is inconsistent with your aspirational identity keeps defaulting back to the behavior that is consistent with your current identity, the one built from years of accumulated evidence about who you actually are. This connects powerfully to the work of Dr. Dan McAdams at Northwestern University, one of the world's leading researchers on narrative identity, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. McAdams spent decades studying how people construct their sense of self through personal narrative and found that behavior is extraordinarily consistent with a person's self-narrative, even when that narrative is limiting, outdated, or factually inaccurate. What this means is that if the story you are telling yourself, consciously or unconsciously, is "I am someone who understands what needs to be done but struggles to actually do it," your behavior will keep confirming that story. Not because you are choosing to confirm it, but because the brain is a narrative confirmation machine. It filters experience, selects evidence, and produces behavior that is consistent with the dominant story running in the background. You cannot outthink a self-narrative with more knowledge. You have to replace it with a different story, and then produce the behavioral evidence that makes the new story credible to your own nervous system. This is where the research of Dr. Amy Cuddy at Harvard Business School becomes relevant, specifically her work on behavioral self-perception, which builds on earlier research by social psychologist Daryl Bem. Cuddy's findings suggest that we do not only act in accordance with who we believe we are, we also come to believe we are who we repeatedly act like. The behavior shapes the identity as much as the identity shapes the behavior, which means the path out of the identity-action gap is not through more self-understanding. It is through small, deliberate acts that begin to build a new body of behavioral evidence. Evidence that tells a different story. Evidence that your nervous system can actually feel, not just understand. Here is the practical framework I want you to build from this week, grounded in everything the research points to. The gap between knowing and doing is not closed by more knowledge. It is closed by identity-level evidence. And identity-level evidence is produced by one thing: small, repeated, completed actions that are specifically chosen because they are consistent with the person you are trying to become rather than the person you have been. So here is the exercise. Write down the one behavioral gap that is costing you the most right now. Not a goal, not an aspiration. The specific behavior that you know you should be doing and consistently aren't. Be precise. Not "I should be more disciplined," but "I know I should be making sales calls every morning and I haven't done it consistently in 3 months." Now write the identity statement underneath it. Not the goal version. Not "I want to become someone who does this." The present tense version. "I am someone who does this." Written as if it is already true. I know that sounds like an affirmation, and I know how that word sits with people who have been burned by motivational content before. So I want to be clear about why this is different. McAdams' research shows that the self-narrative is not updated by believing something new. It is updated by producing behavioral evidence that the new narrative is true. The identity statement is not the destination. It is the lens through which you choose your next action. So underneath the identity statement, write the smallest possible action that a person who already held that identity would do today. Not the full behavior. The entry point, the 2-minute version, the single rep that produces one piece of evidence. And then, and this is the part that draws directly from Skinner's reinforcement research and Damasio's neuroscience simultaneously, when you complete that action, you do not simply move on. You register it, consciously. You sit with the evidence for 30 seconds and you say, "That is what a person who does this actually does. That is who I am being right now. You are not celebrating. You are filing evidence. You are updating the narrative database that your nervous system uses to generate tomorrow's behavior. Peter Gollwitzer's implementation intentions work here too. Write the when and the where. Specify the cue. Make the entry point frictionless. But the deeper work, the identity work, is in the filing of the evidence after the action, not in the planning before it. That is how the gap closes. Not through a single breakthrough, not through finally wanting it badly enough, through the slow, deliberate accumulation of behavioral evidence that tells your nervous system a different story about who you are, one rep at a time, one piece of evidence at a time, until the gap between knowing and doing is no longer a gap at all, but simply the distance between who you were and who you have become. I want to close today with something personal. The version of me who sat in that empty office in 2011, who understood everything about what had gone wrong and still couldn't reliably do what needed to be done, that man was not lacking knowledge. He had plenty of knowledge. What he was lacking was a body of behavioral evidence that told his nervous system a different story about who he was. He was still living inside an identity built from years of almost but not quite, of starting and stopping, of knowing and not doing. The knowledge was real. The desire was real. But the identity hadn't caught up yet. It caught up slowly, through small actions that felt almost embarrassingly modest compared to the scale of what I wanted to build. But each one was a vote. Each one was a piece of evidence filed in the nervous system. Each one moved the story one sentence forward. You know what to do. That is not the problem, and it was never the problem. The question is whether you are willing to start producing the evidence that makes you someone who does it. Not tomorrow. Not when the conditions are right. Not when you finally feel ready. Today. With the smallest action that moves the story one sentence in the right direction. That is where the gap closes. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.